The West Bank city of Nablus has once again become the focal point of a violence between Israeli military forces and Palestinian civilians. On the 20th of November 2025, Israeli forces began a raid across Nablus, intensifying the already high tensions in the region. The raid marks another chapter in the ongoing struggle between Israelis and Palestinians, who have been at odds for decades over territorial disputes, security and political control. As the early morning light illuminated the streets of Nablus, the Israeli army made its move. Large military convoys rolled through the city, signalling the start of an aggressive operation. For the people living in the city, this raid was a frightening reminder of the instability that continues to shape their everyday lives. Nablus, a Palestinian stronghold in the northern West Bank, has been the site of repeated military operations, and today the soldiers were back in full force. One of the first actions taken by Israeli forces was to deploy in several key areas of the city, including Faisal Street, a major commercial hub. Shops that had been running as usual just hours earlier were now caught in the chaos of the military's advance. The Israeli soldiers stormed these businesses, ordering shop owners to open their doors and submit to the occupation's demands. For many, this was an all too familiar scene, one they had witnessed many times before during previous operations. However, the scope and intensity of the raid left people in the city both shocked and afraid for their safety. As soldiers moved from store to store, tensions began to rise. Palestinians in the streets, some of whom had been watching helplessly from their windows, took action. Protesters began hurling stones at Israeli military vehicles, which only escalated the violence. The sound of gunfire and the roar of military vehicles soon filled the air. For the people of Nablus, the situation rapidly transformed from a raid into an open confrontation. A number of civilian casualties followed as clashes between the Israeli forces and Palestinian protesters turned deadly. The streets, once full of life, now echoed with the sounds of violence. Palestinian medics rushed to the scene, doing their best to assist the injured despite the growing danger. But their efforts were hindered by the ongoing military presence, which showed no signs of retreating. Ambulance teams faced enormous difficulty navigating through the streets as the violence continued to spread. Ghassan Hamdan, the director of medical relief in Nablus, described the situation as a relentless wave of aggression. He reported that the Israeli soldiers were not only raiding shops, but also vandalizing property and assaulting civilians in their path. The aggression is ongoing, he stated in an interview. Occupation soldiers are storming numerous shops, assaulting people, and have also raided a mosque and vandalized shops. His account highlighted the alarming disregard for civilian property and lives as Israeli soldiers moved through the city with force. For residents of Nablus, the sight of their local businesses being destroyed and their homes ransacked was a devastating blow, one that reinforced the sense of helplessness many Palestinians feel when faced with the overwhelming power of the Israeli military. Further complicating matters, the ongoing clashes led to road closures, particularly on Faisal Street, a vital artery for both civilians and businesses. The closure not only hindered movement, but also trapped people in areas of the city where the violence was most intense. Ghassan Hamdan went on to explain that ambulance crews had to take drastic measures to protect their own personnel and the injured. Ambulance crews have closed them to prevent further assaults, he said. With the constant threat of live ammunition and tear gas, the medical teams were under immense pressure to continue their work in an environment that seemed to be spiralling out of control. As the situation continued to unfold, there was little sign of any intervention or attempts at mediation. The international community, already concerned about the escalating tensions in the region, watched as the violence intensified. In the past, such raids had often resulted in calls for calm, but on the ground, those calls had little effect. For many Palestinians, this was another round in a long-standing conflict, one that seemed to have no end in sight. The humanitarian situation in the West Bank, particularly in cities like Nablus, has been a source of growing concern for aid organisations as medical teams struggle to keep up with the rising number of casualties. The use of live ammunition by Israeli soldiers has drawn sharp criticism. from various human rights organizations which accuse Israel of using disproportionate force in its operations. While Israel argues that its actions are necessary for security and self-defense, Palestinians and their supporters argue that the scale of the violence is unjustified and continues to punish civilians who have little to no role in the ongoing conflict. The cycle of violence, they claim, is creating an ever-deepening divide between the two sides, with little hope for reconciliation or peace. The raid on Nablus is part of a broader pattern of military operations conducted by Israel in the West Bank. In recent years, such operations have become more frequent and more intense, with Israeli forces taking more aggressive actions against Palestinian residents. Many in the international community view these operations as a form of collective punishment, further alienating the Palestinian population and making it more difficult for peace efforts to succeed. At the same time, Israel faces its own set of challenges, including security threats from militant groups operating in the West Bank and Gaza. These groups often launch attacks on Israeli soldiers and civilians, leading to retaliatory actions by the Israeli military. The raid in Nablus also highlights the ongoing struggle over territory and control. Nablus, like other Palestinian cities in the West Bank, is caught between Israeli settlements, military zones, and Palestinian communities. The presence of Israeli forces in the city is part of a broader effort by the Israeli government to maintain control over strategic areas, despite international calls for a halt to settlement expansion and military operations in Palestinian territories. For Palestinians, the continued Israeli presence in cities like Nablus is seen as a violation of their rights and a reminder of their lack of sovereignty. As the raid in Nablus unfolded, the violence reached its peak. Palestinians gathered in protest, many taking to the streets to express their outrage at the raid and the broader Israeli occupation. The Israeli military, in turn, responded with force, deploying additional soldiers to contain the protests and prevent them from spreading to other areas of the city. The escalation of violence, however, only fueled more anger and resentment among Palestinians, further complicating efforts to restore peace and stability to the region. With each passing day, the situation in Nablus grows more dire. The humanitarian toll of the ongoing violence is becoming increasingly apparent as hospitals in the city are overwhelmed by the number of injured. Medical supplies are running low, and many healthcare workers are facing burnout from the constant pressure of dealing with the casualties of the conflict. Meanwhile, civilians continue to live in fear, unsure of when the next raid will come or when the violence will subside. In the aftermath of the raid, the residents of Nablus are left to pick up the pieces. Shops that were once a vital part of the local economy are now damaged or destroyed, and families that were caught in the crossfire are left to mourn their losses. The raid in Nablus is just one example of the many struggles faced by Palestinians living under occupation. Despite the ongoing violence, however, they remain resilient, continuing to push for a future where they can live in peace and security, free from the constant threat of military raids and violence. For now, the situation in Nablus remains tense, with no clear resolution in sight. As the conflict continues to unfold, the eyes of the world remain on the West Bank, where the cycle of violence shows no signs of ending. Whether peace will ever come to this region remains uncertain, but for the people of Nablus and the wider Palestinian community, the hope for a better future remains alive, even in the face of overwhelming adversity.
لا تم معالجتها مبدئيا
في من عند الوطني شيء
الحواجز العسكرية بمدينة نابلس.
The aggression is ongoing. Occupation soldiers are storming numerous shops, assaulting people, and have also raided a mosque and vandalized shops. Ambulance crews have closed them to prevent further assaults. The main road, particularly Faisal Street, is closed, and clashes are taking place with occupation soldiers who are firing live ammunition and tear gas.
العملية مستمرة بتم إغلاق الطرق الرئيسية وخاصة شارع فيصل حتى هاي اللحظة وفي هناك بعض المواجهات الموجودة مع جنود الاحتلال وهاي المواجهات بتم يعني إطلاق النار والقنابل الغازية باتجاه الشباب.